Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, staring at the massive alien fleet that had appeared in the Vega system. The holographic display showed over 3,000 ships arranged in perfect formation around the human colonies. Each alien vessel dwarfed her own flagship, their sleek hulls gleaming with advanced technology that humanity could barely understand. The communication had arrived 3 hours ago, a formal ultimatum from the Galactic Confederation, delivered in 12 different alien languages and finally translated into broken English. The message was simple. Humanity had 72 hours to abandon all colonies in the Vega sector and return to the Sol system. Any human found outside their home system after the deadline would be eliminated. Chen looked around the bridge at her crew. Young faces, most of them born on the frontier colonies. They had never seen Earth, never breathed air that wasn't recycled through terraforming machines. These worlds weren't just outposts to them. They were home. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Torres from the communications station, "we're receiving urgent messages from all the colony governors. They want to know what our response will be." Chen nodded slowly. She had been expecting this moment for years. Humanity had been expanding too fast, claiming worlds that other species considered worthless, dead planets with toxic air, crushing gravity, or killing radiation. But humans had a talent for making impossible places livable. They saw challenges where others saw only death. The trouble started when human terraforming began working too well. Worlds that had been barren for millions of years were suddenly green with earth plants. The trade routes that had remained unchanged for centuries now had human waypoints offering fuel, supplies, and repairs. The alien powers that controlled galactic commerce were not pleased. The Galactic Confederation had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. 12 dominant species had divided up the stars between them, keeping smaller races as subjects or clients. They maintained order through overwhelming force and the promise that resistance meant extinction. Hundreds of species had learned this lesson the hard way, but humanity was different. When the Confederation demanded tribute, humans had politely declined. When alien fleets blockaded human worlds, human ships found new routes through dangerous nebulae and asteroid fields. When the aliens tried to limit human expansion, humans simply moved faster, claiming a dozen systems while the Confederation debated responses. "Admiral," Torres spoke again, "the colony on Vega Prime is reporting that alien troops are landing. They're demanding immediate evacuation of all civilians." Chen's jaw tightened. Vega Prime housed over 2 million people. Families who had spent generations turning a dead rock into a garden world. Scientists who were on the verge of breakthrough discoveries that could benefit all humanity. Children who knew no other home. "What about the other colonies?" she asked. "Similar reports from all 7 worlds. The aliens aren't attacking yet, but they're making it clear that resistance will not be tolerated." Chen walked to the forward viewport and looked out at the human fleet. 200 ships, a mix of military vessels and converted civilian craft. Against them stood the combined might of 12 alien empires. The largest human dreadnought was smaller than the average Confederation cruiser. The math was simple and brutal. Commander Hayes, her second-in-command, approached quietly. "Admiral, perhaps we should consider the evacuation. We could relocate the colonies to systems outside Confederation space. It would be difficult, but we could rebuild." Chen understood his reasoning. It was the practical choice, the safe choice. Humanity had survived by being adaptable, by knowing when to fight and when to run. But something burned in her chest as she thought about abandoning these worlds. "How many people live in the Vega colonies?" she asked. "Approximately 12 million across all 7 worlds," Hayes replied. "And how many civilian transports do we have?" Hayes checked his tablet. "Maybe enough to evacuate 500,000 people. It would take dozens of trips to move everyone, and that's assuming the Confederation allows us to come and go freely." Chen nodded. She had suspected as much. The ultimatum wasn't really about evacuation. It was about submission. The Confederation wanted to demonstrate that human expansion would be tolerated only as long as it didn't threaten alien interests. Once humanity showed they could be forced to abandon their worlds, they would never be taken seriously again. The bridge fell silent as everyone waited for her decision. Chen could feel the weight of millions of lives on her shoulders. If she chose to fight, many of them would die. If she chose to surrender, humanity would become just another client species, forever limited to whatever scraps the aliens allowed them. A new voice broke the silence. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the Confederation flagship. The main screen flickered, showing the bridge of an enormous alien vessel. The creature addressing them looked like a cross between a spider and a tree, with multiple limbs and bark-like skin. When it spoke, the translator rendered its words in a cold, mechanical voice. Human Commander. I am Fleetmaster Kelthane of the Hegemony. You have 68 hours remaining to comply with Confederation directives. We advise you to begin evacuation immediately. Resistance will result in the complete sterilization of all human colonies. Chen stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back. Fleetmaster Kelthane, I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Space Force. We have received your ultimatum. Then you understand the consequences of defiance. The Confederation has eliminated 17 species for similar violations. Your technology is primitive, your numbers insignificant. Comply, and your people may yet survive to serve the greater galactic order. Chen felt anger burning in her chest, but her voice remained steady. We appreciate the Confederation's concern for galactic order. However, I must respectfully decline your generous offer. The alien's multiple eyes fixed on her with what might have been confusion. You refuse? Perhaps the translation is incomplete. We are offering you the opportunity to preserve your species. This is not a negotiation. I understand perfectly, Chen replied, and my answer remains the same. Humanity will not abandon the Vega colonies. Silence stretched across the communication link. Finally, Kelthane spoke again, his voice filled with something that might have been pity. Then you have chosen extinction. The Confederation has maintained order for 3 millennia. We have seen species rise and fall, empires crumble, and civilizations fade into memory. You are not the first to believe your defiance makes you special. Perhaps not, Chen said. But we're the first humans you've faced. She cut the transmission before Kelthane could respond. The bridge erupted in nervous chatter as her crew processed what had just happened. They had essentially declared war on the most powerful force in the galaxy. Hayes stepped beside her. Admiral, with respect, are you certain about this? We're outnumbered 15-1. Their technology is generations ahead of ours. Chen looked out at the human fleet again. Ugly practical ships built for endurance rather than elegance. Vessels crewed by people who had grown up on worlds where every day was a struggle for survival. Commander, do you know why humans succeeded where other species failed on these worlds? Our adaptability, I suppose. Our willingness to live in harsh conditions. Partly, but mostly because we're too stubborn to know when we're beaten. Chen turned to face the bridge crew. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Prepare for combat operations. We're not leaving. As the human fleet began moving into defensive positions, Chen couldn't help but smile grimly. The Confederation had made one critical error in their calculations. They assumed that superior technology and overwhelming numbers would be enough to force humanity's surrender. They had no idea what humans were willing to do when their backs were against the wall. The real war was about to begin. The first shots of the Battle of Vega Prime were fired at exactly 0800 hours ship time. The Confederation fleet moved forward in perfect formation, their massive dreadnoughts leading the advance while smaller vessels spread out to surround the human colonies. It should have been over in minutes. Captain Zixth watched from the bridge of his Hegemony battleship as the human fleet began its response. The alien commander had participated in dozens of these enforcement actions over his long career. Usually the inferior species would either surrender immediately or put up a brief, hopeless resistance before being crushed. The humans appeared to be choosing the second option. Then something happened that Zixith had never seen before. Instead of forming defensive lines around their colonies, the human ships accelerated directly toward the Confederation fleet. It made no tactical sense. They were outnumbered and outgunned, yet they were charging straight into the alien formation like primitive warriors with no understanding of modern warfare. Weapons officer, Zixith commanded, target the lead human vessels. Demonstrate our superiority quickly so the others may surrender with dignity. The first exchange of fire lit up space between the two fleets. Confederation energy weapons struck human shields, causing spectacular explosions that should have crippled or destroyed the target vessels. Instead, the human ships emerged from the blasts damaged but still fighting, their crude kinetic weapons hammering at alien hulls. Zixith frowned at his tactical display. Human weapons were primitive, using solid projectiles instead of energy beams. But those projectiles were moving at incredible speeds, and there were so many of them. The human ships seemed to carry far more ammunition than any civilized vessel would waste space on. "Sir," reported his sensor officer, The human cargo vessels are launching some kind of small craft. Zixith looked at the display and felt his confidence waver. What he had assumed were civilian transport ships were disgorging thousands of tiny fighters. The small craft swarmed toward the Confederation fleet like angry insects, moving in patterns that hurt to watch. Impossible, he muttered. No biological pilot could survive those acceleration forces. But the sensor readings were clear. Each human fighter carried a living pilot, and they were pulling maneuvers that should have killed them instantly. Banking at 15 gravities, spinning through turns that would liquefy most species, diving directly into point defense grids that no sane being would approach. The fighters were taking terrible losses. Zixith watched dozens of them destroyed by his ship's defensive systems, but for every fighter that died, 2 more seemed to take its place, and the survivors were learning, adapting their attack patterns in real time based on what they observed. "Sir, we have hull breaches on decks 7 through 12, reported his engineering officer. "Those human projectiles are punching right through our armor." Zixith couldn't understand it. Confederation armor was rated to stop any weapon the humans should possess, but human kinetic rounds weren't just solid metal. They were complex multi-stage penetrators designed specifically to defeat energy shields and composite armor. It was as if humanity had studied Confederation defenses for decades and designed weapons specifically to counter them. The second shock came when proximity alarms began screaming throughout the alien fleet. Human boarding pods launched from those suicidal fighters were punching through Confederation shields and latching onto alien hulls. The concept of boarding actions had been abandoned by galactic civilization for centuries. Why risk biological life when weapons could do the job from a safe distance? Zixith soon understood why the humans preferred personal combat. The boarding pods disgorged soldiers in bulky armor, who moved through Confederation ships like unstoppable forces of nature. Security footage from across the fleet showed the same horrifying scene repeated over and over. Human Marines fighting with a ferocity that paralyzed their opponents. Confederation soldiers were trained and equipped for civilized warfare. They expected their enemies to surrender when faced with superior firepower, to negotiate when casualties became unacceptable, to behave rationally according to established military doctrine. Human Marines did none of these things. The security feed from Deck 7 showed a human soldier continuing to fight after losing an arm to plasma fire. Another human used his own body as a shield to protect his squad mates while they planted explosives. When the squad was finally cornered by overwhelming numbers, they detonated their charges at point-blank range, taking half of Zixith's security force with them. "All units, repel boarders," Zixith commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. How do you fight an enemy that views death as acceptable, even preferable to surrender? Meanwhile, Admiral Chen coordinated the impossible defense from the bridge of the Defiance. Her ship's hull glowed cherry red from multiple hits, but human engineering had built her vessel to survive punishment that would cripple more elegant designs. Where alien ships prioritized efficiency and performance, human ships were built like ancient tanks, crude, over-engineered, and nearly impossible to stop. "Damage report," Chen called. "Hull breaches on 8 decks, main engines at 60%, port weapon arrays offline," reported her chief engineer. "But we're still in the fight, Admiral." Chen nodded grimly. The Defiance was dying by inches, but she was taking enemy vessels with her. Human tactics were simple and brutal. Get close enough that alien technological advantages meant nothing, then pound the enemy into scrap with overwhelming firepower. The human ships were faster than they appeared, using gravity assist maneuvers and debris fields to mask their approach. They fought dirty, using the alien formation's own size against them. When Confederation ships tried to target human vessels, they often hit their own allies instead. "Admiral, the Mars Hammer is requesting permission to ram the enemy flagship," reported her communications officer. Chen considered the request. The Mars Hammer was crippled, her crew already evacuating to escape pods, but she still had engines and a full magazine of nuclear warheads. Permission granted. All vessels clear firing lanes for the Mars Hammer's final run. The battered human cruiser turned toward the massive Confederation command ship, her engines straining to build velocity. Enemy fire converged on her from a dozen directions, but her armored hull absorbed the punishment. At the last moment, her captain detonated the ship's entire nuclear arsenal. The explosion was visible from the surface of Vega Prime. When the light faded, the Confederation flagship was a broken hulk, Her command crew dead and her systems dark. The first day of battle ended with results that should have been impossible. Humanity's fleet was still fighting. They had lost 60 ships to the Confederation's 40, but those 40 losses represented casualties the alien alliance hadn't experienced in generations. More importantly, not a single human colony had fallen. Across the Confederation fleet, alien commanders struggled to understand what had gone wrong. Their tactical computers had predicted a swift victory. Instead, they faced an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each exchange of fire, learning from every mistake and adapting faster than should be possible. Fleetmaster Kelthane stood in the wreckage of his command center, his multiple eyes focused on the tactical display. The human fleet was damaged but unbroken, still protecting their colonies with the same stubborn determination they had shown from the beginning. "Send a message to High Command," he ordered. "Request immediate reinforcements. The humans are not what we expected." On the surface of Vega Prime, human civilians watched the battle through the thick atmosphere, knowing their fate hung in the balance. But instead of fear, many felt something they had never experienced before: pride. Their defenders were standing against impossible odds and refusing to break. The war was just beginning, but humanity had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that technological superiority and overwhelming numbers were not enough to guarantee victory. Sometimes stubborn courage and the refusal to surrender could change everything. In the depths of space, human ships limped back to defensive positions around their colonies, their crews already preparing for the next assault. They knew the aliens would return with more ships and better tactics. But humans had something the Confederation didn't understand: the absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for. The battle for humanity's future had begun, and Admiral Chen's fleet was still in the fight. 3 weeks after the first battle, Dr. Veltar stood before the Confederation High Command with research that would change everything. The Thylorian scientist had spent her career studying military psychology across dozens of species, but her analysis of human behavior during the Vega conflict had shaken her understanding of warfare itself. "Honored commanders," she began, her crystalline voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "We are not fighting a normal enemy. The humans exhibit behavioral patterns that have no precedent in galactic military history." Fleetmaster Kelthane, his carapace still bearing scars from the battle damage to his ship, leaned forward. "Explain their tactical advantages. Our forces report that human weapons are more effective than they should be." Dr. Veltar activated her holographic display, showing footage from Confederation security cameras. "The weapons are not the primary concern. Observe this recording from the boarding action on your vessel." The assembled alien commanders watched in uncomfortable silence as human marines fought through the corridors of Kelthane's ship. The footage showed something that violated every principle of civilized warfare: soldiers who continued fighting after receiving wounds that should have incapacitated them, warriors who chose death over surrender, beings who seemed to view sacrifice for their comrades as natural and expected. "Notice how they coordinate without verbal communication," Dr. Veltar continued. "They anticipate each other's actions, share resources automatically, and maintain unit cohesion even when their commanders are eliminated. This suggests a form of collective identity that we have never encountered." General Krextool of the Dominion forces shifted uncomfortably. His occupation troops on Vega 4 had reported similar disturbing observations. "Doctor, our ground forces report that human civilians are equally problematic. They do not accept surrender or occupation as normal conditions." "Precisely," Dr. Veltar replied, "which brings us to the core issue. Humans do not fight for resources, territory, or even survival in the traditional sense. They fight for abstract concepts that our translators struggle to render: freedom, dignity, self-determination." The holographic display showed surveillance footage from the occupied colonies. Human children, barely old enough to walk, were being taught what could only be described as resistance tactics. Elderly humans, too frail for physical labor, were found manufacturing improvised weapons. Every farm, every school, every civilian building contained hidden caches of supplies and equipment. "They have been preparing for this war for generations," Dr. Veltar explained. "Not preparing for a specific enemy, but preparing for the concept of resistance itself. Every human settlement is designed to function as an insurgent base. Admiral Chen had anticipated this development. From her temporary command center aboard a captured Confederation vessel, she reviewed intelligence reports that confirmed her worst fears and greatest hopes. The aliens had superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but they had never faced an enemy that improved with every battle. Her new flagship, the Retribution, was a hybrid creation that embodied human engineering philosophy. Captured alien. Technology had been integrated with human systems in ways that horrified alien designers, but proved remarkably effective. The ship was ugly, asymmetrical, and utterly functional. It could be repaired in the field, operated by a skeleton crew, and would keep fighting long after it should have been destroyed. "Admiral," reported Commander Hayes from the engineering station, "the modifications to the shield generators are complete. We've increased power output by 30%. But the alien engineers insist the system will explode within hours." Chen smiled grimly. "How long have they been saying that?" 2 weeks, ma'am. Then we have at least another week before we need to worry about it. Human engineering didn't prioritize elegance or efficiency. It prioritized results, even if those results came from systems that should be impossible. The real breakthrough hadn't been technological, however. It was the discovery that human adaptability extended far beyond individual learning. Entire human populations were modifying their behavior based on battlefield observations from other sectors. Tactics that worked on Vega Prime were being implemented on Vega 7 within days without any formal communication between the colonies. Dr. Veltar's analysis had identified this as humanity's most dangerous characteristic, collective learning at an unprecedented scale. Other species adapted through institutional knowledge passed down over generations. Humans adapted in real time, sharing innovations across their entire population faster than the Confederation could respond. On Vega 4, General Krextol's occupation forces discovered the true extent of human preparation. What had appeared to be normal civilian infrastructure revealed its dual purpose when resistance began. Every building had hidden passages. Every public area had concealed weapon storage. Most disturbing of all, human children as young as 12 demonstrated tactical knowledge that rivaled military academy graduates. "How is this possible?" Krextol demanded of his intelligence staff. "Their educational records show no formal military training for civilians." "Sir," replied his chief analyst, "we believe they integrate survival and resistance training into their basic education. What they call history lessons and civic duty are actually comprehensive courses in asymmetric warfare." The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't simply refused to withdraw from the Vega sector. They had been preparing for generations to resist any force that tried to control them. The colonies weren't just settlements, they were fortresses designed to turn any occupation into a nightmare. Human technological adaptation proved equally troubling. Within weeks of the first battle, human engineers had reverse-engineered captured Confederation equipment and begun producing improvements. Not through superior understanding, but through the kind of brute force experimentation that horrified alien scientists. They tested weapons on themselves. They deliberately exposed their equipment to enemy fire to study its effects. They modified their tactics in real time based on battlefield observations, often implementing changes that violated basic safety protocols but proved devastatingly effective. The breakthrough came when human scientists working with scavenged alien materials produced their first major innovation: personal shield generators. The devices were crude, bulky, and consumed enormous amounts of power. By alien standards, they were failures. By human standards, they worked well enough. Suddenly, human Marines became nearly invincible. Combined with their already aggressive tactics, shielded human soldiers could walk through defensive positions that should have stopped armies. They didn't fight like civilized beings. They fought like forces of nature. But the most disturbing development was the effect human resistance was having on Confederation forces. Species that had never faced sustained opposition were beginning to show signs of what human military doctrine called combat fatigue. Alien soldiers requested transfers away from human sectors. Units that had maintained perfect discipline for centuries began making critical errors. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the psychological impact was spreading through the Confederation military faster than their commanders could contain it. Dr. Veltar concluded her briefing with an analysis that would change the course of the war. Honored commanders, we face a fundamental problem. Our entire military structure is based on the assumption that rational beings will surrender when faced with impossible odds. Humans appear to be immune to this basic principle of warfare. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her final assessment. They do not fight to win in the traditional sense. They fight to prove that they cannot be forced to surrender. Each battle they survive, regardless of casualties, demonstrates that coercion has limits. This makes them incredibly dangerous, not just militarily, but philosophically. The chamber fell silent as the alien commanders processed this information. They had expected to face another primitive species that would quickly submit to superior force. Instead, they had encountered something unprecedented, a species that viewed freedom as more valuable than survival itself. The real war was just beginning, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the Confederation wasn't certain they could win it. 6 months after the first shots were fired at Vega Prime, Ambassador Thys of the Viridian Republic stood before the Confederation Council with evidence that would shatter the foundations of galactic civilization. Her species had served the Confederation faithfully for over 1,000 years, but the intelligence reports she carried would change everything. Honored Council, she began, her scaled features reflecting the chamber's ceremonial lighting. My people's intelligence networks have been monitoring human communications since the conflict began. What we have discovered poses a threat to galactic stability, far beyond military considerations. The 12 representatives of the founding species listened with growing unease as Thys presented her findings. Human transmissions weren't just military communications or tactical updates. They were something unprecedented, a species-wide philosophical discussion about concepts that had no equivalent in Confederation languages. They speak constantly of freedom, self-determination, and individual rights, Thys explained. These are not abstract concepts to them. They are fundamental beliefs that govern every aspect of their society. More disturbing, these ideas are spreading to other species through proximity to human settlements. High Counselor Nexivar of the Hegemony dismissed her concerns with a gesture of his primary manipulator. The humans are primitive. Their ideology cannot threaten civilizations that have endured for millennia. But Thys had prepared for this response. Her holographic display showed surveillance footage from across Confederation space. On a dozen member worlds, previously compliant populations were exhibiting what intelligence reports called human-like behaviors. Work slowdowns, protests, demands for representation in Confederation governance. The Hegemony's client species are asking why they need permission to colonize worlds in their own systems. Thys continued. The Trade Consortium's member worlds are questioning tax policies that haven't been challenged in 1,000 years. The human concept of resistance is proving as contagious as human biological warfare. The footage was undeniable. Species that had been model citizens for countless generations were suddenly demanding explanations for policies they had previously accepted without question. Worse, they were using human terminology, human concepts, human arguments about the nature of governance and individual rights. On the agricultural world of Kepler's Garden, the native Polari had gone on strike for the first time in their recorded history. Their demands were simple but revolutionary. They wanted to choose their own leaders and keep a larger portion of their harvest for local use. When Confederation administrators tried to negotiate, the Polari responded with a phrase that sent chills through the intelligence community. Taxation without representation is tyranny. The humans had somehow taught an entire species political philosophy in a matter of months. Meanwhile, in the Vega sector, Admiral Chen was planning humanity's most audacious operation yet. The captured Confederation shipyards orbiting Vega 6 had become the birthplace of a new kind of vessel. Human-alien hybrid warships that embodied the worst fears of alien engineers. Admiral, reported Chief Engineer Martinez as he wiped grease from his hands. The first batch of hybrid cruisers is ready for testing. I have to warn you, they're unlike anything in the technical manuals. Chen walked through the shipyard, examining the strange vessels taking shape in the construction bays. They were ugly, asymmetrical things that violated every principle of aesthetic design. Confederation technology had been grafted onto human hulls in ways that made alien consultants physically ill to observe. They looked like they were built by children with spare parts, noted Commander Hayes. Good, Chen replied. That means they'll be underestimated. How do they perform? Martinez grinned. Like angry bulls with plasma cannons. They're not fast or pretty, but they can take ridiculous amounts of damage and keep fighting. The alien systems complain constantly about operating outside normal parameters, but they work. The hybrid ships represented everything that made humans dangerous. They ignored conventional wisdom, combined incompatible technologies through sheer stubbornness, and prioritized function over form. Most importantly, they could be built and repaired using resources from any captured alien facility. But Chen's real achievement wasn't technological. It was political. Using captured Confederation communication networks, human settlements had made contact with resistance movements across the galaxy. Species that had been subjugated for generations were suddenly coordinating with human military planners. The first joint operation took place in the Rim territories, where human naval forces supported a Zilani uprising against hegemony occupation forces. The attack succeeded not through superior firepower, but through something the Confederation had never faced: coordination between multiple species united by shared principles rather than common ancestry. The battle for the Zilani homeworld became a template for human strategy. Small human fleets supported by local resistance movements achieved victories that should have been impossible. They didn't conquer territory. They liberated populations and then moved on, leaving behind species capable of defending themselves. The psychological impact on Confederation forces was devastating. For 3,000 years, their military had faced individual species fighting alone, often for territory or resources that could be negotiated. Now they faced a growing alliance of species fighting for abstract concepts that couldn't be compromised or surrendered. On the Confederation capital world of Axis Prime, emergency sessions of the High Council became daily occurrences. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Uprisings, protests, demands for reform. The carefully maintained balance of power that had preserved peace for millennia was crumbling. The situation is untenable, declared Trade Minister Velkoth. Our member species are beginning to question fundamental aspects of Confederation governance. Some are even demanding withdrawal from our protection. General Krextul, recently returned from the failed occupation of Vega Fru, provided his own grim assessment. The humans have weaponized an idea. They've convinced other species that submission is not inevitable, that resistance is possible. Military force cannot defeat a concept. The Confederation's response was swift and brutal. Troublesome populations were relocated. Protest leaders were arrested. Planetary governments that questioned Confederation authority were replaced with more compliant administrators. But for every voice silenced, 10 more spoke up. The rebellion was spreading faster than it could be suppressed, and at its heart was the human example. 12 million humans in the Vega sector had faced the combined might of the galaxy's greatest powers and refused to surrender. If humans could resist, why couldn't anyone else? Dr. Veltar, now working frantically to understand the crisis, delivered her most disturbing analysis yet. The humans have introduced a viral concept into galactic civilization. The idea that individuals have inherent rights that supersede governmental authority. Once this concept takes root in a population, it cannot be removed by force. Her research showed that the human influence was spreading through cultural exchange, trade relationships, and even entertainment. Human art, music, and literature carried embedded philosophical messages about freedom and self-determination. Species that had never questioned their place in the galactic order were suddenly asking why they needed permission to govern themselves. The tipping point came when 3 entire star systems formally declared independence from Confederation authority. The Antares Alliance, led by species that had been loyal Confederation members for centuries, announced their intention to form a voluntary association based on human principles of self-governance. For the first time in its 3,000-year history, the Confederation faced the possibility of complete dissolution, not through military conquest, but through the collapse of the philosophical framework that had held it together. As reports of new uprisings arrived hourly, High Counselor Nexavar finally understood the true scope of the threat. The humans hadn't just refused to withdraw from the Vega sector. They had introduced a concept that would eventually destroy everything the Confederation represented. The war had evolved beyond military conflict into something far more dangerous, a battle for the future of galactic civilization itself. And humanity, against all odds, was winning not through conquest, but through the simple demonstration that resistance was possible. The galaxy was learning to be free, one species at a time, and once that lesson was learned, it could never be forgotten. 2 years after humanity refused to withdraw from the Vega sector, Admiral Sarah Chen stood in a place that would have been impossible to imagine when the war began. The Great Assembly Hall on New Geneva Station hosted representatives from 47 different species. But this was not the Confederation Council. There were no masters and subjects here, no founding species ruling over client populations. Every being in the chamber had an equal voice in the Galactic Alliance. Chen watched as Ambassador Thys of the Viridian Republic addressed the assembly in her native language. Her words translated instantly for dozens of different species. 6 months ago, Thys had been reporting to Confederation masters about the dangerous spread of human ideas. Today, she was arguing for agricultural aid to recently liberated worlds. The transformation hadn't come without cost. When the Confederation finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, entire sectors had erupted into violence. Ancient grudges suppressed for generations under alien rule had exploded into civil wars. Some species, too dependent on the rigid hierarchy of the old system, had fractured into competing factions. But from the ashes of the old galaxy, something unprecedented was emerging. Species that had been enemies for millennia were learning to cooperate. Worlds that had been forced into economic dependence were developing sustainable trade relationships. Most remarkably, the galaxy's youth were growing up with concepts that had once been uniquely human. Admiral Chen called Representative Zektor of the former hegemony territories. The Assembly recognizes your service in the liberation. Will you address the question of human military advisors in the outer territories? Chen approached the speaking platform, still uncomfortable with the ceremony despite 2 years of diplomatic protocol. She had been a fleet officer, not a politician, but the galaxy seemed determined to make her a symbol of the new order. Representatives, she began, humanity's role in the Alliance must be carefully balanced. We offer our experience and expertise freely, but we do not seek to replace one form of domination with another. Her words were carefully chosen. Human military advisors were training Alliance defense forces across the galaxy, but humans held no supreme command positions. Human engineers shared their adaptation techniques, but only with species that requested them. Most importantly, human colonies remained open to all, species willing to accept the fundamental principle that sentient beings had the right to determine their own fate. The former Confederation core worlds told a very different story. The 12 founding species, stripped of their subject populations and tribute systems, faced a harsh new reality. Some, like the Pragmatic Trade Consortium, had adapted quickly to the new paradigm. Their traders now competed in open markets rather than controlling captive economies, and many had found greater profits in voluntary cooperation. Others struggled with the transition. The rigid hegemony had splintered into dozens of authoritarian enclaves, still convinced that order required submission. Several hegemony worlds had requested Alliance intervention to stop civil wars between factions that couldn't agree on basic governance principles. Dr. Veltar, now serving as the Alliance's chief specialist in post-liberation psychology, had spent months studying the collapse of the old order. Her research centers on New Geneva had become gathering places for beings trying to understand their new freedom. The most difficult challenge, she explained to Chen during one of their regular consultations, is helping species that have never made collective decisions learn to govern themselves. 3,000 years of submission cannot be overcome in a few months. Chen nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Liberation was only the first step. Learning to use freedom responsibly was a much longer process. Some species had embraced self-governance enthusiastically. Others struggled with the responsibility that came with choice. The greatest success stories came from species that had maintained some cultural memory of independence. The Zelani, who had been among the first to join human liberation efforts, had quickly established a democratic federation that served as a model for other emerging governments. Their capital world had become a center for political education. where newly liberated populations learned the practical skills of self-governance. But perhaps the most profound change was in the galaxy's children. On Alliance worlds, human concepts were being taught alongside mathematics and literature. Young beings who would have grown up as subjects in the old system were learning about individual rights, representative government, and the consent of the governed. Chen often visited the integrated schools on New Geneva, watching human children play alongside young Viridians, Zelani, and dozens of other species. The sight never failed to amaze her. Languages she had never heard were being spoken by children who considered friendship across species barriers completely normal. Admiral Chen called a young Thylorian student during one of her visits. "My teacher says humans taught the galaxy about freedom. But what did the galaxy teach humans?" The question caught Chen off guard. She had spent so much time thinking about humanity's impact on galactic civilization that she hadn't considered the reverse. But as she looked around the classroom, the answer became clear. "You taught us that we're not alone," she replied. "Humans always believed in freedom, but we thought we were the only ones. You showed us that every species has the capacity for self-determination. You made our ideals universal. The transformation was most visible in the arts. Human music, literature, and visual arts had spread throughout Alliance space, but they had been transformed by contact with alien sensibilities. Thylorian crystal singers created symphonies that incorporated human concepts of individual expression. Viridian poets wrote verses about freedom in languages that had no previous words for the concept. The galaxy's culture was becoming something entirely new. Chen's own life reflected these changes. The woman who had once commanded a desperate defense of human colonies now spent her time tending gardens on New Vega, a world that had become a symbol of the new galaxy. The planet's surface bore the scars of war, but life was returning. Human terraforming techniques had been enhanced by alien knowledge, creating ecosystems that could never have existed on Earth. On quiet evenings, she would walk through the memorial gardens where the names of the fallen were carved in stone, quarried from a dozen different worlds. Human names were mixed with Zelani, Viridian, and scores of other species who had died fighting for freedom. The memorial served as a reminder that liberty had not come without cost. The war had claimed millions of lives across dozens of worlds. Some species had paid terrible prices for their resistance to the old order, but Chen believed those sacrifices had meaning. Every name on the memorial walls represented someone who had chosen principle over survival, who had decided that some things were worth dying for. When young reporters asked her about the war, Chen always returned to the same fundamental truth. Humanity hadn't won through superior technology or overwhelming force. They had won by proving that freedom was possible, that submission wasn't inevitable, that individuals had the right to choose their own destiny. The real war, she would tell them, wasn't between species. It was between ideas. The Confederation represented the belief that order required hierarchy, that peace meant submission, that stability was more important than liberty. Humanity represented the opposite view, that freedom was worth fighting for, that individuals had inherent rights, that consent of the governed was the only legitimate basis for authority. The outcome of that philosophical war was visible throughout Alliance space. Former client species were governing themselves. Ancient enemies were learning to cooperate. The galaxy's youth were growing up with expectations of freedom that would have been unthinkable under the old system. But Chen knew the victory wasn't complete. There were still authoritarian enclaves scattered throughout the galaxy, still species struggling with the transition to self-governance, still those who believed order required submission. The ideas that had driven the Confederation hadn't disappeared. They had simply been proven wrong. As she stood in her garden watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that existed nowhere else in the galaxy, Chen reflected on humanity's unexpected role as teachers. They had shown the galaxy that resistance was possible, that freedom was achievable, that the powerful could be defied by those with sufficient courage and determination. The lesson had been learned, and it could never be forgotten. The galaxy had discovered what humans had always known, that some things were more valuable than survival, and freedom was one of them. Once that truth was accepted, the odds no longer mattered. The war was over, but the real victory was just beginning. Every day, in classrooms and council chambers across the galaxy, beings were learning to govern themselves, to make choices, to accept responsibility for their own destinies. Humanity had given the galaxy the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that they deserved to be free.